of Ayrshire. What I really want to do is I want to give a sort of, I mean, it's certainly not by any manner of means a comprehensive overview of this period, these periods of prehistory in Ayrshire, but rather I want to kind of look at some of the sort of the trends and discoveries, some interesting bits of research, and also just my thoughts on the significance of this part of Scotland in prehistory, because actually it's in a pivotal place. And the more you kind of look at the evidence there, the more that there's clear that there's something really interesting going on here in terms of a sort of melting pot of different traditions within Scottish prehistory, and that's something I'll sort of try and draw out as we go through. So I'll go through some kind of key sites, some interesting discoveries, and some quirky, weird stuff, and hopefully by the end of it, we'll all be slightly wiser about Ayrshire's really incredible but really understudied and underplayed archaeological resource. Unless, of course, you throw in the island of Arran, which of course I have done just to add to the fun. So here's a little map. So I've been quite broad in the geographical scope for this. I've taken the historic county of Ayrshire, which is sort of, I think, this area that's grayed off on the map, which goes surprisingly far south, almost down to Cairns, and also the island of Arran as well, which is now a part of North Ayrshire Council, so it technically is Ayrshire, so I'm going to include it as well because it's an important part of the story, because you can't really consider mainland Ayrshire, I guess, without considering Arran, and indeed you can't really look at this area in isolation either. It's a bit arbitrary, but it's the kind of the brief I've got. Now, essentially, the areas I've circled on the map are places that I've kind of dabbled in, as it were. I'm not by no means an expert in most of the archaeology here, but I have done some stuff on Arran, which we'll talk about, and I'm pretty aware of the Neolithic of Arran for various different reasons. I did a talk to Dundonald Castle, I don't know, about a year ago or 18 months ago, I can't remember, it must have been about 18 months ago, but I looked quite intensively at the archaeology in the triangle between Kilmarnock, Irvine and Troon, which is a sort of Bermuda Triangle of exciting stuff, which is largely ignored by archaeologists. And then I've also done a bit of research into the Dagon stone in Darvel, which is circled there as well, for a blog post I wrote 8 years ago, one of the kind of stranger archaeological sites in the area. So I've done bits of dabbling, and I'm kind of, but more generally, I have actually literally done some research for writing this lecture. You'll be stunned to hear it's not just made up off the top of my head, and I've actually do have data as well from some research I've been doing, which is really insightful in terms of the way that our understanding of the prehistory has developed in recent years. So I mean, we can take this back pretty far. The first occupants in this area were almost certainly around in 8 or even 9,000 BC. So we've got a very extensive and lengthy period of occupation of this area. But as I say, the focus for my focus this evening will be largely on the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, or the early Bronze Age periods, which is, let's just say, 4,000 to 2,000 BC, and let's not get caught up with arguments about when the Neolithic did or didn't start. Certainly, if you read some authors, they would argue the Neolithic in Scotland didn't start until about 3,700, but I'm going to push it back to 4,000 because it's a rounder number and easier to remember for everyone. So and here's a little timeline, which I think I got from the Scarf graphic novel about Scottish archaeology, and we've got here I've covered the bit of the bit of the map that's relevant. The timeline to the right here is covered up by various heads on the screen, so I'll just I'm moving us all over to the other side. So we've got this sort of division of prehistory into the Mesolithic from 4,000 BC on earlier, the Neolithic, which is the first part of the Stone Age, from about 4,000 to, let's just say, 2,500, and then the Bronze Age actually probably runs on till about 700 or 800 BC. But I'm only going to talk about the first few centuries of the Bronze Age, really. So this is obviously a very long time ago, and so the evidence is quite patchy the further you go back in time. So I'm going to just broadly overview some of the kind of more headline background things before we start to dive into some of the detail. So the landscape's obviously quite pivotal in the way that the archaeological record is formed and is made available to us, and also the way that humans have interacted with this place. It's obviously got a lot of coastline, it's got islands, and it's also got lots of fertile floodplain and fertile coastal land, which is prime farming land. But then because of the way the authority borders are drawn up, and this is all really arbitrary, of course, because these authorities are just completely modern constructs, you've got quite a lot of hilly or even mountainous ranges as well, including bits of the southern uplands, some of the mountains to the south of Glasgow, and of course Goat Fell on and then mountains in north of Arran. So there's a huge amount of variety in this landscape, which I think probably explains why we've got quite interesting variations and traditions of monumentality and settlement evidence, because people are occupying different parts of the landscape and doing different things, and it also affords us the opportunity to have different ways of finding archaeology. So, you know, finding stuff in the uplands is maybe more about upland investigation, laser and LiDAR surveys and things like that. But then in the lowlands, we've got huge potential for crop marks and also things revealed by developer-funded work. So the landscape shapes the way that humans interacted with this place in prehistory, and also it shapes how archaeologists work with it today as well. So you know, so some of these patterns are real and some of them are probably slightly artificial as well. Now, the other thing that is worth bearing in mind before we sort of look at some of the detail of prehistory here is that in the Mesolithic and Neolithic in particular, this would have been a heavily wooded landscape. So while it's easy for us to imagine that, for instance, the first farmers had fields and were out tending their crops and grazing animals and stuff in relatively open fields like we have nowadays. In fact, you know, it probably wasn't until well into the Bronze Age that woodland clearance became so extensive that it really started to shape the landscape. So, and we're thinking about Neolithic stuff in particular, you know, we have to imagine that these were people living amongst the trees, especially, you know, in coastal and river areas of the landscape, and that these were actually landscapes that were at least partially wooded with kind of these birch and mixed hazel and elm forests, and lots of hazels as well. We know that, you know, there's lots of hazelnuts from Mesolithic evidence from the west coast of Scotland and so on. So this is a landscape that would have been different from what it is now, in terms of the visibility and the way people moved around the landscape and the way that they interacted with the world around them. So that it's just worth remembering that, because it's quite easy to forget, you know, when you see lots of dots on maps and individual monuments, that these monuments actually sat potentially within trees rather than them being out in open spaces, although some would have been in clearances, as with this quite fancy digital reconstruction here, which is actually from the landscape around Heathrow Terminal 5, but, you know, it will suffice for the purposes of this lecture. So I'm not going to say very much about the Mesolithic because I don't know much about the Mesolithic of Ayrshire, but in essence, it's largely dominated by lithic scatters, which are collections of stone tools and the working material from making stone tools, especially out of flint and Arran pitchstone and various other sort of silica-rich rocks to make sharp cutting tools. And in particular, in the Mesolithic, there was lots of microliths used, which are these little tiny blades, there's a picture there of a few blades balanced on someone's fingertip, which gives you a sense of scale. And these would have been hafted onto like sticks and bones and antlers and so on to create different sawing and cutting tools. And these were like kind of the Mesolithic go-to tool. And the reason we have a fairly good sense of where people were living, especially along the coastline, is because of the work of individuals like Malcolm McNeill, who was essentially an amateur field walker who spent a lot of time, as you can see here, between 1963 and 1976, endlessly walking ploughed fields, trying to pick up bits and pieces of these stone tools. And he identified 67 possible Mesolithic sites along the Ayrshire coastline. So that gives us a real sense that people are living, at least for part of the year, in the Mesolithic down by the coast. Now, there's also extensive upland settlement as well, especially around places like Dare Reservoir and some of the upland lochs. And that is probably suggesting that in the Mesolithic, people were moving around the landscape and they were exploiting the coast at certain times of the year and upland areas at other times of the year. And these patterns aren't necessarily influencing what happens later on. But this coastal settlement is something that's a recurring theme into the Neolithic period as well, which is something I'll come back to fairly soon. So for the Mesolithic, at least up until about 4000 BC, almost all of the evidence we have are stone tools found in these sort of senses. There's very few sites where there's anything. There are sites where there's been some pits and some fire spots suggesting campsites, but there's not really a lot to get your teeth into. I mean, I guess a Mesolithic expert might be able to quite happily fill an hour's worth of lecture material with Mesolithic Ayrshire, but it's beyond my capability to do that. One thing that's worth noting, though, which it kind of brings us into a bit more into towards the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, is this incredible object that was found in 1938 in I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Shelton Moss, which is very, very close to Dundonald Castle. In fact, you can a great view of the moss from Dundonald Castle. And I'll come back to this area later because there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's clearly an area that was very important in prehistory, throughout prehistory. But this was found by someone walking down by the river, and he just found this lying on the side of a path, which is quite incredible, and it ended up in the hands of Lacaille, who studied it and analysed this amazing red deer antler object, which is obviously some kind of fishing or hunting tool. And it's been radiocarbon dated to the fifth millennium BC. That's handy to get the date wrong on the slide. Sorry about that. The 5th millennium BC. So it's right at the end of the Mesolithic. So it's a late Mesolithic object, and it sort of shows the huge potential to find other stuff other than stone tools when you look in the right kinds of places. And Shelton Moss is somewhere that has got huge potential for future research. And stuff's being found there quite frequently, and the wet landscape means these sort of things survive well. So there are things other than lithic scatters, but anyway, let's move on to the Neolithic. And there's been a few things that really make a big difference for understanding of the Neolithic period. I mean, firstly, people did things on a bigger scale that left more of an imprint on the landscape. So they built monuments, they created houses that were much more substantial. And they generally did things that we find in the archaeological records much more readily than Mesolithic people. But the other advantages we have in this area are that we have a very fine crop mark record, which has been documented quite extensively, really since the 1970s onwards. And for those of you who are not aware of this phenomenon, essentially crop marks are a way that archaeological sites are found when the underground or under subsoil archaeological features impact on the growth of cereal crops above the ground. So there's a couple of little cartoon illustrations in the slide here that sort of make the point that basically if you've got a ditch or something which is beneath the surface of the ground, it impacts on the crop growth, the crops grow faster, and then you can start to pick up patterns and differential crop colours from the air. So to spot these crop marks, you have to be in a little aeroplane, like my old boss, Bill Hansen, and his picture there, I think he's actually flying over Romania in that particular picture, but it's a nice picture of Bill. And Bill was really a pioneer of aerial photography in Ayrshire and also Lanarkshire, which were places that were quite neglected in comparison with the East Coast. Most of the aerial reconnaissance in Scotland from 1976 onwards was done from Edinburgh. And so from the Royal Commission and Ancient Historic Monuments of Scotland, now HES, or part of HES. And so they spent a lot of time flying around the East Coast or doing jollies to islands, if we look back at what they were up to back then. And the West Coast didn't get anything like as much attention. So individual flyers like Bill were able to fill in some of those gaps, and Bill found some really notable sites in these areas of West Central Scotland. So the crop marks are really a significant part of the resource here. So, and I just picked out one at random, which is a nice example for a site called Nether Muir, which is near Moncton. It's very close to that roundabout, actually, which is at the end of I think it's the A77, which has got that big fancy BP petrol station. And that, I think that is actually the A71, that road there. So you've got or whatever that road's called. It's probably not the A71. But we've got, so hopefully you can see here that there's a black and white picture, so it makes it slightly more tricky. But you've got these markings in the crops. So these are all cereal crops in the fields, and I've highlighted a few here. There's a very black, dark mark here, which is a ditch essentially, with a round thing inside, which may be a roundhouse. And then there's a very thin, almost as if someone's drawn it with a pencil, which is probably a fence line. So these are two probably later prehistoric Iron Age or maybe early medieval enclosures, probably settlement sites, farmsteads. And then we've also got other things like this linear feature, which is probably a field boundary, which is just gone, or it could be a pipe, which is more modern. And then you also get, crop marks are also good at showing up lots of amorphous natural features as well, like this kind of big blob at the bottom. So crop marks are a really phenomenal resource, and they're largely unexploited by archaeologists, which is always frustrates me because they tell an incredible story. You know, none of this stuff is visible above the surface of the ground. You couldn't see these sites if you stood in the field, but you can see them under the right conditions from the air. Although that's usually only for a week or two every summer, and it's better to be dry summers. And you might have saw a lot of media stuff about crop marks in 2018, I think, or 2019 when there was a drought. So I checked this out earlier on, and there's 217 crop mark sites in the mainland bit of Ayrshire. There's not that many in Arran, because Arran hasn't been flown over very often. And you can see the little distribution map here from Canmore shows that they are essentially largely focused along the coastline, with a few inland ones. Now, this is partly because crop marks, you find crop marks in cereal crops, so therefore the coast is a focal point. But actually what's happened here is, I'm fairly sure, is that the person has been flying, this is from Edinburgh in particular, has flown over, they've probably flown down the A71, and they've found sites along the A71, and then they've gone up or down the coastline and just followed the coast down to kind of Cairns, Ryan and Stranraer, because there's some really amazing crop marks in the Stranraer area. And so I think probably this is a lot of transit routes between kind of cutting across central Scotland and going down. So actually what we're looking at is a distribution of crop marks that have been spotted on someone's favourite flying route. So being cynical about it, but it shows the huge potential. Now, not all of these sites are prehistoric. Some definitely are, and I'll show some examples as the lecture goes on. I just chose out a couple at random here. Here I've got a site called Balnowlert, Ballantrae, where there's a really big enclosure with a ditch around it. Again, probably a later prehistoric ditched enclosure of some kind. But who knows? I mean, it's only ever been photographed once in the 70s, I think, and it's not been looked at since. But then other weird and wonderful things show up as well. And I should have indicated this with an arrow because it's quite difficult to see, but there's a line of dots that runs across this field right on the coast here. And that's marking where there was a line of concrete anti-tank blocks during the Second World War. And these are essentially the blocks were removed and they left hollows, which have since become crop marks because they're just depressions that have affected the crop growth. So crop marks in this area certainly show sites probably from the right to the start of the Neolithic right up until the last 50 years. So it's a massive resource, but it's quite underused. The other big factor here is the impact of developer-funded archaeology. Now, research into prehistoric Ayrshire has largely focused on Arran, and there's been a distinct lack of sort of mainstream activity about this area, partly again because traditionally the Royal Commission had an East Coast focus, or spent a lot of time in Argyll and Bute, but didn't really do places like Ayrshire or Renfrewshire or Inverclyde with much enthusiasm. So there was a bit of a kind of paucity of stuff there known in these areas until developer-funded archaeology came along and then started to reshape what we know about this area. So essentially, since the late 1980s and early 1990s, anytime any development happens in Scotland, the developer has to pay for an archaeological evaluation or an excavation, depending on the circumstances. And so this is a sort of random sample of the landscape in places where development is more likely. And this has led to massive discoveries across Scotland and a really huge leap forward in our understanding of a lot of different types of sites. And I've been trying to get to grips with this. So for the Neolithic data, for instance, and this is slightly out of date because I haven't updated it for a while, between 1985 and 2014, there was, by my estimation, 23 Neolithic sites were excavated or identified through in Ayrshire, sorry. 23 Neolithic sites were excavated, and that's over 28 seasons of excavation. And only one of those was a research excavation, which was Never Muir on Arran in 1985. So, in other words, every Neolithic site that's been investigated in Ayrshire since 1986 onwards was found because of a developer doing something. And that could be a housing development, a road, infrastructure upgrades, pipelines, various things like that. So in other words, this is an incredible resource because some of these are really impressive sites. I'll mention a few of them as we go along because, for instance, they've expanded our understanding of Neolithic settlement in this area. So it's a really massive resource, but sometimes the results of these excavations are not always easy to access, or else there's bigger problems, as we'll see as we go on. So, and some of these are real success stories. So, for instance, there's a report online by Guard published a couple of years ago, which is about work done in Ayr Academy, where they were doing some upgrading around the school campus, and they ended up finding archaeological features from the Mesolithic through to the late Bronze Age, including burial evidence. So this was all, the only reason that the archaeologists found this stuff was because they were there ahead of a development of a school. And that's quite a common feature across all of Scotland. And that was published online, and that's a great success story and puts another dot on our map and is another pottery assemblage and so on. But things are not always that positive, and there are a few problematic sites in Ayrshire and Arran, which I will not say any more about the details of these things really, because they are problematic sites, and it's difficult to see how these problems will be resolved for the time being. But one of the biggest problems is the excavations that were undertaken in 1999 by Gard again, and that was along the route of the Arran Water Ring Main pipeline, which basically runs along the String Road from Brodick to Machrie Moor, Blackwater Foot area. And they found tons of stuff of all different periods, including some amazing Neolithic stuff, but this project has never been published, and that's not Gard's fault, so I'm not trying to blame Gard. It's a whole series of circumstances. If it's anyone's fault, it's Glasgow University's fault, but that's a whole different story. But this picture from the archive, which I have, is quite a nice indicator of the glamour of developer-funded archaeology, where you just have to go in and dig stuff regardless of the time of year and the conditions. And there's some other pictures in there with some very muddy-looking excavators. And so there are lots of successes, but amongst these numbers of these sort of 23 Neolithic sites, there's a few that remain unpublished and unexploited. And of course, I thought let's keep topical, of course, because we have a bit of Neolithic archaeology in the possession of a certain Donald Trump. And although I think this is pre-Donald Trump in terms of his ownership of Turnberry Hotel and Golf Course. But in 2001, my old pal Gavin McGregor, who must have been a child at that time, carried out an evaluation at Turnberry Hotel in advance of the proposed outdoor pursuit centre, whatever that is, at Turnberry Hotel. And during that evaluation, they found, as the DES entry says, they found Mesolithic occupation evidence and 4 pits, 2 of which are probably late Neolithic. So it's probably a late Neolithic settlement site with a lot of Mesolithic stuff in the same location. So I guess I don't know whether Donald would want to fund some future excavation. I don't think he's been allowed back into the country, is he? So he would just have to post a check or something to make sure that work can be done. I'm sure he's got a moral responsibility to fund this, although I think he's got other stuff in his mind just now. Anyway, so crop marks and developer-funded archaeology have really radically transformed our understanding of the Neolithic and Bronze Age of Ayrshire, and have gone from a position where not long ago there was lots of blank bits on maps to actually dots on maps and a bit of knowledge being generated. At this rate, I'm going to take about 5 hours, so I'm going to have to speed up. So anyway, let's look at Neolithic Ayrshire in a bit more detail. Well, it's not just Machrie Moor, but Machrie Moor is obviously, it's like the jewel in the crown, if you want to describe it as that, I suppose. But it's actually just like a leaping off point for some quite amazing stuff, really, and a real variety of things. I mean, it's very similar to this far southwest of Scotland, the Solway coastal plain, where you've got this kind of curious combination of different Neolithic traditions, megalithic upland traditions, in particular with megalithic chambered cairns, but also with standing stones and sites like that as well. But also lowland eastern traditions, I would call them, things like Cursus monuments and timber monumentality, and to a lesser extent Henges, although they've got a broader distribution across Scotland. So we've got these things going on where we've got kind of almost not competing, but just differing monument traditions in the same area, which suggests to me this is a real melting pot and probably a place where people are travelling in and out from all over the place in Scotland and also from Ireland and Cumbria and so on as well. So it's a well-connected place that's got lots of different traditions. You know, there's loads of grooved-ware pottery, late Neolithic pottery found in this area, which has got very strong connections to both Orkney and also to the south of England as well. So it's a well-connected place that's got a lot of fine examples of some really classic Neolithic monuments types in particular, but also the developer-funded stuff has really shed some light on both farming practice and also settlement in the area as well, which is actually surprisingly rare for Neolithic mainland Scotland. There's actually, you know, as we'll see in a minute or two, there's actually not a lot of evidence for houses in mainland Scotland. And a lot of the stuff that we have found has been found in this area, which is quite exciting and probably not really been quite recognised yet in any synthesis of this material. And there's other stuff going on here as well. I'm fairly sure there's two major ceremonial centres, maybe pilgrimage centres, at Machrie Moor and also around Dry Bridge in Dreghorn area, which is again near Dundonald Castle, which is why I like to emphasise that. And there's also other things going on, which are, including things like lots of rock art in the area and so on. So it's an area with a lot of variety and a lot of interesting stuff. Which is maybe not at first apparent when if you read a story about Neolithic and Bronze Age Scotland. Ayrshire doesn't get mentioned very often, but it probably should really. So we've got really fine evidence for Neolithic farming practice, in particular on Arran, where I think that probably out with the Northern Isles of Shetland and Orkney, the best evidence we have for instance, for Neolithic ploughing activity is found on Arran. There's 4 sites on Arran now where ploughing has been found in the form of these ard marks, which are essentially scrapes made by a scratch plough or something like that, or an ard plough, which are probably about breaking up the turf to allow crops to be sown, although they may have had other purposes as well. So, and a really incredible collection of those found at Machrie Moor in advance of the construction of 2 stone circles, but also quite a few examples found on excavations along the Water Ring main pipeline as well, which, as I say, are unpublished. So this map in the middle here, which is a bit gloomy on this slide, unfortunately, is a paper that I'm publishing later this year with PSAS with Dean Wright, which is looking at physical traces of farming in Scotland that might be Neolithic. And when this map was being made, there's 2 dots here which have been accidentally ended up on the mainland, but there actually should be an Arran, so I've had to get that corrected for the final version of the diagram. So actually there should be 4 dots on Arran. So it's quite an incredible concentration of stuff. But there's other bits and pieces as well which are interesting. A site that was excavated, I don't know, about 15 years ago by Gavin McGregor and Ali Beckett, a site at Maybole, and I can't be any more specific because the site is just called Maybole, was just basically a series of Neolithic pits. But some of those pits contained burnt seaweed, and they also found a small assemblage of goat fecal pellets, which is something I bet you didn't think you were going to be learning about this evening. And those are an incredibly rare discovery in Scotland, but are almost certainly evidence of not only that goats were present, clearly, but also that there was probably, it was part of a manuring strategy, and the seaweed's probably being used for animal feed. So we can see little hints here of farming practices through animal husbandry and also crop management as well. And again, this sort of stuff is quite rare in Scotland to find, these evidence for manuring and fertilizing and manipulated soils and so on. So it suggests that there's stuff in this area that can shed some light on what's happening at this time. In terms of settlement, initially it looks quite unpromising because you've got this map of Scotland that was published by Gordon Barclay in 2003, curiously missing off chunks of Scotland. I'm not quite sure why. And this map is basically probable Neolithic settlement sites that were known at that time, although most of these are just pits and places with fire spots and campsites and so on. Not many of them are buildings. And you can see down in the map here that there's a big blank space, which is where we have Ayrshire and Arran. And I'll come back to timber halls in a minute, but in the early Neolithic, these people were probably living in small rectangular buildings like this reconstruction here, which I can't even remember where the reconstruction's from. I think it's from an English site. But they would have been quite small, 1 or 2 room structures with maybe a family unit could have stayed inside with a fireplace and quite straightforward plank or timber wall and wattle and daub walling to protect from the elements and pitch roof, etc. So, and these there's only about 15 of these types of buildings are known in the whole of Scotland, but developer-funded archaeology has really shed light on some really exciting stuff in Ayrshire, which is not really properly been synthesized into the broader discussion of these types of things. I mean, I wrote a paper about Neolithic settlement a few years ago, and I hadn't really some of this stuff wasn't even ready for me to include into that discussion. So this is a site called Hill House Farm, which is near Kilmarnock, which was excavated in 2016 in advance of a water pipeline. And you can see here the kind of environment for the excavation, where you've just got this big swathe cut through the landscape. And this was, and one of the key sites they found here was this, the remnants here of a Neolithic building, which was described in the local press as older than Stonehenge, which is Stonehenge is always the kind of relative point for everything in the British Neolithic. And essentially you've got this very sketchy building, which is defined by post holes. You can see the post holes here that have been excavated, and the structure here is about 7 or 8 meters by about 10 meters, and it's one of these small rectangular buildings I was talking about. Perhaps looked something like this reconstruction based on an English a Neolithic timber house found in England. So this, although this doesn't look like the most exciting thing that's ever been found in archaeology, actually this is a very rare example of a Neolithic house being found in mainland Scotland. And amazingly, there is another very similar house that was found slightly earlier than that in the 2000s by Guard during their excavations at Lane Newton, which is near, as you can see where it is, that's Loudon Hill in the background there. So that gives you a sense of where this is. And this is a site that again has got a whole bunch of pits and post holes in the trench, the evaluation trench. Is another pipeline. You can see the pipeline going off into the distance. And this is a bit fuzzy, sorry, but basically they found another Neolithic rectangular building, quite similar in size to the Hill House one. So two of, maybe about 20% of the convincing Neolithic buildings in mainland Scotland are found in Ayrshire. So there's something really interesting going on here in terms of the survivability of this stuff, and also the fact that maybe this is somewhere where we should be looking harder to try and find Neolithic houses because they're so rare. And the reconstruction there, which is a different type of Neolithic house being reconstructed this time at Butser Farm, shows again what these buildings may have looked like, relatively small, with this in this case with the roof going down to the ground level. So these are really exciting discoveries. Now, as well as the these timber houses, there's also a large collection of Neolithic pits which have been found across Ayrshire as well, and also Arran. And these pits essentially are often regarded as being a proxy for settlement. So you don't tend to find remnants of houses and campsites near these, but you do find pits full of Neolithic stuff, some of which could be interpreted as being the waste from a hearth or something like that. So Hill House, again, that site, there's a lot of pits that were found with broken pottery, with fire and hearth sweepings and that kind of thing. So probably evidence of some kind of settlement going on there. And the site that I mentioned earlier on at Maybole with the goat jobbies was again a sort of group of small pits, which included things like Neolithic pottery sherds and lithics and Arran pitchstone and various other things going on in there. Again, a possible domestic site with some sort of kind of with animals being grazed nearby. And a more spectacular example of this, but as yet unpublished, I think, is a site that was found in Girvan in 2007. I need to consult my notes here. At one of the best names for an archaeological site in Scotland, it's William Grant and Sons Warehouse 31, which is when a warehouse has been constructed at the whisky storage area. Guard archaeologists found a cluster of almost 100 cut features, many of which are Neolithic, including post holes and pits, which have got, again, lots of Neolithic pottery and burnt deposits and so on, suggesting quite an intensive area of activity. It's one of the biggest pit clusters in Scotland. And that's a site which I'm hoping when it's published will help, again, shed some more light on what's going on here. So these are quite dramatic sites, even though, they don't look very glamorous. And they suggest that there's a lot of stuff going on here. And it's also surviving, which is something that's really important and doesn't necessarily happen in other parts of Scotland in these numbers. Now, in terms of when we're talking about settlement in this area, one of the things that's really that is worth mentioning, and I will briefly mention, is a site that some of you may have heard of if you're local, at Dreghorn, called Station Bray. And this is a site that was excavated in advance of a Wimpy housing development in 2003-04. Quite an extensive area was excavated, and this is a plan that I got from a report that I was sent anonymously by someone on this excavation. So I've got some of the data, but not very much. And it was a big area was excavated on this ridge, and they found loads of stuff. It was completely unexpected. They didn't expect to find anything of what was there, but they found loads of Neolithic stuff and also a quite substantial quantity of early medieval archaeology as well. And essentially, the developers couldn't afford or didn't want to pay for the excavation to be completely written up and finished properly. So what happened basically was that the excavation was the excavation was kind of finished, as much as this fact that everything was recorded and removed from the ground before the houses were built, but there was no budget to do anything more with this site, so therefore it remains unpublished, and a lot of the material has never been looked at by anyone. So there's a huge amount of potential. Now, I mention this site really as another kind of failure of developer-funded archaeology, but I mention this because at the time there was a lot of wild claims that were made by the excavation team. Well, maybe not wild, because I don't really know, because I haven't looked at the stuff in detail, about the significance of this site as Station Bray. So we have there was an article in the Herald at the time of the excavation that talked about this site as being similar in scale to Skara Brae, which is quite a claim to be made for a lot of post holes in Dreghorn, including an assemblage of 750 pieces of groove, which is a massive assemblage of that type of pottery, and so it's really significant stuff. At the time, Mike Pitts, who's the editor of British Archaeology magazine just now, wrote, I think this is also from the Herald, about how significant this was, and I think he might have just been going on what he was told by the excavation team, rather than having first-hand experience of this. And the site director, Tom Wilson, at the time was quoted in a now defunct website, I think. He said, "This is one of only 5 timber halls to be discovered in Scotland," suggesting that this is a settlement that's got a Neolithic timber hall and also a series of 8 huts, which is a massive settlement. So this would be the biggest Neolithic settlement site ever found in mainland Scotland, but unfortunately it remains undiscovered. I mean, Neolithic timber halls are massive buildings. This is there's 6 or so of these have been excavated across Scotland now. You can see in the map that they're largely concentrated in eastern Scotland, but there's also Lockerbie Academy down here, which is the closest example. Station Bray here is a slight outlier in that group, but it would be amazing if it was a timber hall, because these are massive buildings, although they don't tend to be associated with grooveware, so there's something slightly funny going on there. But ultimately, this promise has remained unfulfilled, which is a shame, because I think there was a lot of expectation amongst local people. This was something that was going to be quite major. And in this book, Villages of Britain by Clive Aslett, there's actually a little quote that talks about Dreghorn as being not only about its a pneumatic tyre history, which I didn't know anything about, but also the excavation in 2004 uncovered remains of a Neolithic well dating from 3500, which would have supplied water to a community like that of Skara Brae. But whereas Skara Brae was abandoned, Dreghorn may have been continuously occupied for 5.5 millennia, making it the oldest still functioning village in the country. So what a claim. But unfortunately, that's kind of where the story stops, because after all that excitement, nothing's happened. The excavation remains unpublished. All the stuff is remaining in stores somewhere and being looked after, but nothing's being done with it, and there's no money to do anything with it. And the site is not marked in any way. Lauren and I visited this a couple of years ago, and there's nothing there. You would never know that a major Neolithic settlement had potentially been found here. So while there's even more potential for exciting Neolithic settlement to be found in this area, if something can be done about this. And as I say, there's a pit cluster here as well, and there's lots of grooveware and so on. So an amazing site. So the settlement evidence is incredible for this area, but we've also got some really spectacular monumentality as well, which is another aspect of prehistoric life. There's a quite a good range of Neolithic chambered cairns, which are essentially megalithic burial monuments, or at least monuments that parts of bodies were stored in, perhaps for use in rituals and ceremonies and so on. And these are sites which are generally associated with northwestern Scotland and the Northern Isles, but there is quite a strong tradition of megalithic tombs down in the southwest of Scotland. And it's interesting that in this area we have a couple of different traditions of tombs. We have Clyde cairns and also Burgrenin type tombs, both within Ayrshire. And essentially these are monuments that function pretty much the same way, but they would have just had they had a slightly different architectural style and a different way of accessing the tombs. And so we've got both types available in Ayrshire. There's 10 documented in Canmore, none of which are really particularly notable, the ones in mainland Ayrshire, although there are a few that are in quite good condition. Most of them are very ruinous. And they're, again, as you would imagine, are concentrated around the upland areas of the area, of this kind of Ayrshire area. And then we've also got about 15 or 16 on Arran, more or less all in the south of the island. And I'll come back to them again in a few minutes. So there's a bit of a mixed bag here, but these are suggesting, again, that there's a settled Neolithic population in this area who are using megalithic architecture that's common across much of the west and north of Britain. So again, there's a strong connection here. And some of the most spectacular sites are in Arran, of course. places like Cairns, shown here in the photo, and Moor, which is a tomb on the south of Arran, which aligns on Ayrshire Craig. It's a really spectacular monument. And there's been some nice work done recently by OC Archaeology and Forestry Land Scotland in terms of doing 3D scanning and so on of some of these sites. And you can see the results here of these very nice illustrations. And so I think there's probably things cooking under that are bubbling under that are going to see a bit more work done at some of these sites on Arran, but I'm not sure if there's any plans to do anything on the more ruinous tombs on the mainland. And there's been some really nice research done into the connections between the megalithic tombs on Arran and the broader landscape, which I just wanted to briefly mention. Some really nice stuff that was done by Andy Jones back in the late 1990s. And he argued that essentially the megalithic monuments on Arran were a reflection of the broader landscape on the island. The landscape, Arran has got the boundary fault running through it, the Highland Fault. And it's got in the north of that, it's very mountainous and a granite landscape. To the south of that, it's much more sandstone dominated. And Andy argued essentially these monuments are representing the landscape. Some of the standing stones are sandstone, some of them are granite, they're red and they're white in their colour. And he thought there was a lot of symbolism associated with that. And he even took it down to looking at the tombs, suggesting the tombs were deliberately constructed using different types of rocks to bring disparate parts of the landscape together, which may have related to different tribal groupings or different territories within the island of Arran. So there's something about the kind of the geology of this island which makes it significant, and that is reinforced by the presence of Arran pitchstone on this island, which is a very glassy rock, almost obsidian-like, which is only found on the island of Arran, and which was highly prized in prehistory from the Mesolithic onwards, and is found all over the place in Ireland and England and Scotland and Orkney, and was used to make really fine cutting-edge tools. So the geology, the topography, the shape of the land is probably an important symbolic aspect of the way that the people in prehistory lived in these kinds of areas. And I'm sure that the similar processes were going on in the mainland as well. Now we have those megalithic traditions, but also there's also some very good earthwork traditions of monuments as well in this area. And I want to flag up some of the best examples, because again, these are sites which are actually really spectacular, but because they're not visible on the surface anymore, then they're little known and little appreciated. And this is an amazing site, Bridge Cursus, which is an enormous rectangular early Neolithic enclosure, which is next to the village of Dry Bridge, which is very close to Dundonald Castle. And this is a site that I actually first visited when I was doing my PhD in the late 1990s. And these appalling photographs on this slide here are actually directly taken from my PhD. It's embarrassing how bad the pictures are. They're like photocopies of photocopies. I have no idea how I got away with it, but they're just stuck in with glue as well. It's terrible. But anyway, so I walked along it, and it's interesting. The Cursus ends at the River Irvine, and it's probably a processional routeway of some kind. And you can get, and this aerial photograph, I should have marked it up, but you've got a ditch here running across here, and then the other ditch is running down here. So these ditches are quite far apart. They're about 50 meters apart, and the whole monument is at least 200 meters long. So this is a massive enclosure. You know, that is equivalent of quite a few football pitches worth of area, and it also dwarfs the village. There's a roundabout there. There's houses at Dry Bridge, and it's totally dwarfed by this massive enclosure. And this photograph highlights it better. This is a later photograph, but it's not quite so clear. So I've marked in where the Croc marks are, and that shows the boundaries of this monument. So this is a really giant enclosure that probably dated to about 3,600 to 3,300 BC, maybe a processional routeway that ended up people moving from one end down towards the river and kind of cutting across this big meander. And the scale of this is quite mind-boggling, and you can't see it on the ground. It's, you know, if this was an earthwork, or if this was marked by something really visible, it would be a really important archaeological site. But because it's been ploughed flat, then, and it's only the ditch that survives under the ground, it's relatively unheralded. But I would imagine that putting a few trenches into that ditch would probably be quite an interesting exercise. Maybe one for Lauren, or in the future, or maybe I might get my trowel out as well, actually, for that. There's another Cursus in the area, which was discovered in 2017 as part of a LiDAR survey that was carried out by HES. And essentially, this is where a plane flies over, it fires hundreds of lasers at the ground. The lasers bounce back and then those are analysed, and they can pick up some very micro scale changes in the topography of the landscape, including being able to use algorithms to remove vegetation like trees and so on. So it's a very powerful archaeological technique that goes beyond my capability to really understand. But when we were doing this survey, they found hundreds of new archaeological sites on Arran that had never been found before, including a Cursus. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any good images of the Cursus, but you have to just take my word for it. And somewhere in this photograph, there is a double banked enclosure that's 1.1 kilometers long. And what does it say? They're 40 meters wide. So this is a massive enclosure. It's huge. It's sort of, I could pretend I can see it in this picture, but I can't see it in this picture, and I don't have a picture of the data, and I've not been to either. I'm hoping to go and visit, well, I was going to go and visit last year, but couldn't, obviously. I'm hoping to go later this summer if I'm able to, and it's certainly an excavation target to try and look at, because there's only, of the sort of 50 or so Cursus monuments known in Scotland, there's only 2 that have got any three that have got surviving upstanding earthworks, and this is one of them. So it's got a very exciting that this has been found, and also it's in Newer Muir, so it's part of a broader complex of monuments as well. Again, probably some kind of routeway that went through this landscape, and one that we still are only just getting to grips with, but an exciting new discovery. And Cursus monuments are, as I said, there's about 50 or so sites in Scotland. They date to the second half of the 4th millennium BC. Often the earlier ones are defined by timber posts, the later ones by ditches and banks, but they're always rectangular enclosures. They're always very long and relatively narrow, and they're usually regarded as being processional routeways. But let's just say that they're indicators of communities who were able to get enough labour to build big monuments, and that they were marking off quite significant places and probably taking some very good quality farmland and then removing it from the system by creating these enclosures that I'd imagine that people weren't allowed to farm inside. There was other stuff happening in there, and you often have got a close connection with rivers as well. So again, this is a broader British monument tradition that is very much present in Ayrshire, and there's big potential, I think, for future work being done here. There are also henge monuments in the area as well, which are monuments really, in mainland Scotland, are actually monuments of the early Bronze Age, really, rather than the late Neolithic, as they used to be regarded. And there's a few in Ayrshire, and these are sites which are circular or oval earthwork enclosures with an internal ditch and an external bank. And they're, again, often regarded, and again, this is, of course, a cop-out, as being ceremonial or ritual monuments, certainly social gathering places. And they range in size from 10 metres across to, hundreds of metres across at Avebury, which is the biggest henge in the south of England. And there's a range of them, of sites that are actually quite weird and interesting in Ayrshire. There's certainly at least one Croc mark henge, which is next to the dry Bridge Cursus. And very difficult to see here, but there's 2 circular marks, one on either side, which are curiously exactly the same size as this roundabout and street arrangement, which is always slightly disturbed me, as how identical in size they are. But anyway, I don't think there's any, it's just a coincidence. So we've got these, I think this is definitely a henge because it's got a classic henge appearance. It's cut in half by the road, but it's got a nice entrance on that side, and I think that's a henge. This one could be a later circular enclosure, but on the other hand, they are suggestive of their position being equidistant on either side of the Cursus, that there's some kind of arrangement going on here. So presumably these were built here maybe 1,000 years after the Cursus, but the Cursus would still have been visible at that time. So there's suggesting a monumental tradition here in this location. There's also a few other henges, and there's no henges in Arran, which is interesting, and something that's probably worth a bit more speculation and thought, because there's a lot of amazing Neolithic stuff happening and Bronze Age stuff happening in Arran, but no henges. So I wonder why that is. So in Canmore, it documents 4 henges in Ayrshire, or in the Ayrshires. We have got Dry Bridge, where I think there's probably 2, not just 1. Broad Sheen is essentially an earthwork enclosure about 45 metres across, which is barely visible on the ground, and which nothing more is known about, but it could be a henge. WOSAS have looked at it and they think it might be a henge monument. Number 2 in this the diagram here is Lidston, which is another earthwork enclosure which is barely visible on the ground. It's about the same size as the Broadsheen site, but when Royal Commission field workers went there in 1980, they were told by the farmer that he'd bulldozed it 15 years previously, so very little of that site remains, which is not but unfortunate. But it could be a little henge as well. The other site is a Croc mark site, which is in the grounds of Clane Castle, very difficult to see in this aerial photograph. There's a very, very faint circular marking here. It's down in Canmore as a possible henge. I consulted with Derek Alexander, the National Trust archaeologist, yesterday, and he told me that the Thistle Camp did an excavation here a few years ago, and they found medieval material. So it's very much more likely some kind of medieval site, and it's not a henge monument. So unfortunately, it still is a henge as Canmore. So we've added one at Drybridge, but removed one at Clay and Castle. So there's a few henges here, which suggests that the monumentality is continuing, but maybe not with the same enthusiasm as earlier in the Neolithic. And there's also probably these major ceremonial focal points, landscapes that continue to attract attention for centuries and millennia, where monuments are built again and again, and things are added to the landscape. So, and probably these are major focal points, not necessarily for where people are living, but for pilgrimage, for people to visit and come together for communal events and activities, and are probably the main power sources in the landscape in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. So Drybridge, I'm sure, is a really significant centre with the Cursus, one or two henges. There's also a standing stone there, which may be a remnant of maybe broader standing stone monumentality. And also the Station Bray site is very close to this as well, which is almost certainly, at least, if nothing else, a significant Neolithic site, even if it's not a big settlement. And also, I would say that the hill that Dundonald Castle sits upon would have been a significant landscape feature that would have probably been quite significant in prehistory, and may have been one of the reasons why people were drawn to this area. And then next to it, we've got Shelton Moss, and there's loads of detail here. Please don't worry about it, because this is for my Bermuda Triangle presentation I did a while back. But basically, Shelton Moss keeps on producing stuff in terms of Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age stuff. And really, the detail is not important, but what it suggests is that there's a lot of people who are doing things in this landscape again and again. And those things are often sacred and ceremonial in nature, like deposition, throwing things away, votive deposits, and so on. And also indicative of broader contacts, for instance, Arran Pitchstone, and Arran is very clearly visible from this location. It dominates the landscape to the west, but also a pair of axes, Neolithic axes found. I can't remember when they were found, but those axes were made in Ireland, or from material sourced from Ireland. So there's a lot of connections here, and Drybridge, etc., is just off this map here. So we've got a big concentration of activity here, and probably a major power centre in southern Scotland at this time. And the other classic place, of course, that would have been a major ceremonial centre is Moor. And I barely need to say anything about Moor. It's famous, it's significant in a range of different ways. But maybe the thing that really intrigues me about this is not just the fact that there's all these stone circles here, but also that when Haggerty excavated here in the 80s, they found a series of timber circles which predated some of the stone circles. And this is the same place all those aardmarks were found as well, which ties this into very much an East Coast timber monumentality tradition, which again suggests this is a real melting pot of timber and megalithic traditions here, which is really interesting, and actually has the same sequence if you want to look at it as Stonehenge, moving from timber monumentality to stone monumentality, which Mike Parker Pearson argues is a movement from monuments of the living to monuments of the dead. So maybe we've got that kind of broader Neolithic cosmological worldview being played out at Moor. And this is a place that continued to be important from the early Neolithic right through into the Bronze Age, including having settlement evidence, roundhouses, all sorts of stuff that John Barber looked at in particular in the 80s. And it's just a really significant place. And the Cursus being found there is just another element of the magic of Moor. And some of the stuff that was found in the Arran Water Ring Main included Neolithic settlement potentially, and also aardmarks, which again is another part of the puzzle. And I think that actually Moor needs to be revisited. No one, for instance, has really done any work trying to work out where the standing stones came from, which has been done for Callanish, Bring Brodgar, Stennis, and so on. So there's actually some really nice projects that could be done here, although we don't want to take away from the potential of other areas as well. And there's other standing stones around as well, about 28 standing stones potentially recorded in mainland Ayrshire, or the county of Ayrshire, which are difficult to date and often have been moved from original locations. Doonfoot and Dunure is now next to some houses. The Dagon stone has been moved at least 3 or 4 times and had a stone ball added to the top as well, which is a great indignity for a standing stone. So lots of potential bits and pieces of Neolithic and Bronze Age activity here, but we can't say much more because these sites are unexplored and don't really add very much other than just dots on maps. And the other thing which is part of this tradition, as I start to draw to a close here, looking at the time, is abstract rock art, which is actually fairly common, but not. But it's actually a kind of not one of the more dense scatters in Scotland. Scotland's Rock Art project has been looking at these over the last few years and started to validate some of these sites. And the thing that really interests me about the rock art in this area is that there's some weird sites, some really incredible and unusual places that definitely suggest that that people here were probably carving these cup and ring mark symbols, but doing their own thing and making their own stylistic choices, which are not being made elsewhere in Scotland, which is interesting, suggesting there's quite, it's like local rock art for local people, which I always like that kind of thing. So the site on one of the main sites on Arran, Stronach, is just weird. It's got all these kind of strange key type motifs. There's this incredible carved stone that was found at Tarbolton in the 18th century, which is a kiss slab. So it's a Bronze Age burial site, and it's very much passage grave tradition. And then there's Ballochmyle near Mauchline, which is without a doubt one of the most spectacular prehistoric rock art sites in the world. Absolutely worth visiting if you can get to it. And the thing that's really awesome about this site is not just the deep red sandstone the symbols are carved into, but the fact that it's on a vertical cliff face, which is almost unique, really. I mean, I can't think of any other examples, and it's incredible. So it's definitely worth a visit, but it's not signposted. It's not on any maps, really. It's difficult to find. It's a site that should be a tourist attraction because it's incredible, but it's maybe because it's tucked away in Ayrshire. It remains in the shadow of Robert Burns, as with so many other things in the county, I think. And who knows? Maybe Rabbie got inspiration from these carved stones. Sometimes, who knows? That's definitely well off my areas of expertise. And what do these symbols mean? Who knows? I'm not going to spend any time on this really, but they are another part of the picture here, and they're often not integrated with the broader Neolithic pattern, but they're in that kind of hilly upland fringe of Ayrshire and Arran, which continue the megalithic traditions of those areas as well. So really, this kind of running through all this stuff, we're talking about a place here that's incredibly well connected. It's got traditions that are shared from as far afield as Ireland and the south of England and Orkney, but it's also got its own distinctive regional traits as well. It's in a place that's clearly a major movement, a place of movement in prehistory, not just in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, but in other periods as well, both with things and materials and people going from Ireland over to Scotland and vice versa. There's Irish Sea connections with Cumbria and so on. And then it's very clear that the Ayrshire itself is a gateway to the rest of Scotland, whether it be up the lochs towards places like Kilmartin and Oban, or whether it be upland up through up into all the other lochs around Loch Lomond and the Trossachs, or also a gateway into the Bigger Gap and through to the other side of Scotland as well. And also not that far from the Clyde catchment area as well. So it's a really well-connected place. And I suspect that probably lots of people were moving through this area, and they were probably, their influence is rubbing off, and they were also learning from people who lived here. And people who lived in this area of this part of Scotland were probably travelling about a bit as well. So compared to a lot of other places in Scotland, it's actually probably really well connected, and they really took advantage of its connections topographically and geographically and culturally to make it a real melting pot. But there's lots more that can be done here. I've mentioned potential projects already. I mean, there's a real need to have some of these big developer funded projects published, which is difficult to see how that will happen, but it may be possible. And certainly it's something I'm trying to think about how we can do. I think it'd be really nice if someone were to write a popular and an accessible introduction to this stuff, because I think actually anyone who visits this area should really be interested in visiting Ballochmyle or some of the other, Dundonald Castle, obviously, because the toasties are great in the cafe. But also, there should be more made of the Neolithic and prehistoric archaeology of Ayrshire in general. It's not just about Arran. It's not just about Mackley Moor, although I have in the past been quite keen to promote Arran as well. And if you look at the tourist information for Ayrshire, for instance, there's a big emphasis on Mackley Moor, obviously. If this leaflet I found online recently, which is an Ayrshire and Arran tourism board leaflet for cultural and heritage attractions in the area, and if you look at the archaeological stuff, is apart from castles, there's lots of castles, is few and far between, and it kind of comes under churches, landmarks, abbeys, and archaeological sites, and it's more or less all Mackley Moor sites or chambered cairns on Arran. So there's lots more archaeological sites in Ayrshire that are just not being highlighted to visitors, and could be used to market the county, I think, in interesting ways, and could bring more people. And and again, it could be more than Rabbie Burns. Although, having said that, I've also been working with Gavin McGregor over the last few years to try and think about how we could better market and exploit Arran's incredible prehistoric archaeology. There's a blog post that I wrote with Gavin a couple of years ago called "Let's Rebrand Arran as Scotland's Prehistoric Island." Because of the amazing stuff there, and basically it's as good as Orkney, but it's easier to get to. That was the basis of the argument. There's millions of people in Scotland live within an hour or two of Arran, whereas getting to Orkney is a nightmare. So I think that there's huge potential there. But I think also you should think about how else can the Ayrshire's prehistory be exploited a bit more, because there's some really amazing stuff, and there's some stories that could be told and can be brought out in a bit more detail with a bit more effort. And the last thing I want to just briefly mention is a bit of self-publicity as a project that Gavin and I also ran in Arran in between 2013 and 2017, although hopefully it's not finished, which is building burn, where in Arran we called this thing Burning the Circle, where we basically built a series of timber monuments were based on Arran's prehistoric sites, and then we ended up the process burning them down in a huge fiery conflagration with a free fire festival. And the last event we ran in 2017, you can see me down in this image here as a white-faced shaman, and a bit of performance going on there out of desperation, and that event attracted over 300 people. And I would be delighted to do a build and burn at Dundonald Castle, and to highlight and to showcase the amazing prehistoric archaeology of Ayrshire. And I'm pretty cheap, so maybe we can make it happen sometime. You can pay me in toasties. So with that, sorry I've spoken for so long, but with that I will end, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has got any. So thank you very much for your attention and listening.